Hey everyone, welcome to week 3 of our series, Jesus Is. And during this series, we have been looking at the life of Jesus and what it really means for our life 2,000 some years after his death. And so I want to quickly start with a recap of what we've looked at. And in week 1, we looked at the fact that Jesus was more than, and that the stuff in all of our lives that fail to compare to Jesus. And they fail to compare with who Jesus is. And Jesus asked really that all of those that followed him put him first and lay down everything else in their life. And simply put, he is worth it. He's worth laying down all these other things, and he's worth more than all of these other things put together. We also looked at how Jesus is more than anything that is happening in our lives as well. Any struggle or any trial, Jesus is more than those places in our lives, and he's more valuable and stronger than those places in our lives. Last week, we explored the idea that Jesus wasn't just a list of rules, and following Jesus is not simply about just simply doing certain things a certain way or doing things even the right way. Following Jesus really is about having a relationship and letting the change come from that place in our lives. And this week, I want to look at the reality that Jesus is more than a fairy tale. He's more than just a story that we tell to make ourselves feel better or feel like we're doing something or to have a reason or explanation for things in our lives. I have a friend, his name is Eric. I don't think he'd mind me using his name here, but Eric is a devout atheist. And not only does he not believe in religion, but he firmly and devoutly believes that religion is the starting point to all the world's problems and all the problems in society. Religion, in his mind, is the reason for every evil that happens in the world, and he really follows closely to some of the renowned authors in that thought process, the Richard Dawkins and others. And one day I remember that Eric had made a statement, and it basically was stating that to believe in God, that he didn't believe in God or Jesus because he outgrew the stage of fairy tales a long time ago. He was simply too old and much too smart to believe in this fairy tale. And as I got studying and looking at the trends of people that claim to be atheists, especially in the middle school age demographic, this is kind of a growing trend to mythicize Jesus. About 40% don't believe in Jesus or believe in a religion claim that Jesus was never real. And a whole movement, in fact, has been given to it. And so I wanted to address this just a little bit today and to try to do it in a way that is not completely dry and boring, no promises. But I also want to put this disclaimer that this is just a starting point. This is a tip of an iceberg of all the information that's out there on this. And so I'm trying to give a couple hard points on this that could lead and give you starting places to do more evaluation and investigation. But before we do that, I want to look at why it matters. And although it doesn't take much to figure out why this is probably really important, but if we can't substantiate the life of Jesus as being real, then the rest of our claims as Christians and followers of Jesus are probably defunct as well. They probably don't have much to stand on. But there's also this ingrained tension when having this conversation that much of the evidence that we could use could be seen as biased evidence, right? Or trying to ask that the Bible defend the Bible is kind of the definition of circular logic. Or really is it? Also, the reality is that Jesus lived a long time ago. And how are we really sure that the Jesus that we read about is the same Jesus that actually lived? I mean, can we really trust the disciples to tell the whole truth? And, surely they're going to stretch the truth a little bit about Jesus, right? In reality, all the claims of Christendom come down to the truth of the claim that Jesus ever existed in the first place. So I want to take this quick and unthorough look, for the sake of time, at the claim that Jesus was just a fairy tale and kind of debunk it a little bit and say that Jesus was more than just a fairy tale. And so the first question I want to address is the fact that we can't trust the Bible. And while I understand this thought process, I want to remind you of something that is really important that we miss a lot of times when we approach this discussion. And that is that the Bible is not just one book. It's not just one person's perspective. So if we were saying that the Bible can't defend the Bible, well, that would be true if it was all one book and one person defending itself. But the reality is that the New Testament alone is a compilation of 27 different books written by several authors and spanning several different time spans. And not only that, but these letters and these narratives were very popular and they're really studied. And especially based on what we know of the early church. They were studied from pretty early on, in fact. So think about this for just a second. Pretend just for a second that I were to send a text to all of you this week. And in that text, I told you that we had such a great time having Drake here this weekend. And the next day you're at school and you heard somebody say, man, dude, I heard that Drake was at Vineyard this weekend. That's where you go to church. Were you there? Did it happen? How cool is that? And one of two things is probably going to happen. First of all, you're going to lie because, well, it's Drake and you want to be in on that, right? You want to be the cool kid that was a part of that. Or two, you'll be like, nah, it didn't happen. It'd be cool if it did, but it didn't happen. Now, odds are across the group of people that are here listening to this, not everyone's going to lie and say, yeah, sure, I was there, it happened, right? At least one of you is going to be honest enough to say, no, didn't happen. Now take that experience and multiply that by 100 or 1,000 and all the number of people whose lives were touched by Jesus. You see, throughout this time frame, they placed Jesus in the middle of large crowds that would have seen him and known him. Paul makes the claim in 1 Corinthians that Jesus appeared to over 500 people after his resurrection. Now, think about this for a second. Do you really think that 500 independent people would lie about that? What about, do you think that they would lie about that if it meant that they could die for lying about that? Because that was the situation they were in, that if they were a follower of Jesus, they could be put to death and persecuted. So they had a motive to lie about it, in essence. Now understand, this isn't some story that someone made up and said, okay, 500 years ago there was this guy named Jesus that walked on earth. It doesn't work that way. In fact, many ancient scholars claim that these conversations about Jesus happened within one lifespan of Jesus. They happened within between 10 and 30 years, up to 70 years of Jesus' first interactions with people. So these would have been the same people reading this that actually encountered Jesus in the first place. Many ancient scholars, then those that also still don't claim to be Christian, would say that the fact that Jesus lived is probably one of the most attested historical facts. They would say that there's simply no grounds for questioning. There's enough proof there that we probably shouldn't question his life. But what about moving beyond the Bible? Like surely someone else saw Jesus, right? Like somebody else besides just the people of the Bible saw Jesus and encountered him. And the answer to that is yes, resounding. And some of the most renowned historians of Jesus' time speak of Jesus. And many of them are the ones that would much rather not talk about Jesus. Some of them that talked about Jesus are his followers. And some of the ones that talked about him were ones that talked about Jesus and his followers were the ones that they were saying that they were the problems that were causing this change in cultures. And they were upending certain things that other people were doing in the ways of life in society. Now, think about this way. I know some of you, and if something were to happen that didn't fit with what your parents think you do at school, you aren't going to be the one to tell them. It's human nature, self-preservation, right? You know what I'm talking about. You get in trouble at school, and the teacher promises, I'm not going to tell your parents. You're safe. This is a safe zone. My guess is probably most of you, you're not telling your parents either. But the thing is, there's a list of people, many of them that it would have been much easier to leave Jesus out of the narrative, that still talked about Jesus. Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Origen, Eusebius, and there's so many more that discuss Jesus and his followers. And that's not all of it. I said that's not all of them. There's many more that talk about him. And that's not even including the ones that were followers of Jesus or were part of the way, as it was called at that point. You have several writers that are not part of the Bible, that were Christian writers or wrote Christian letters to each other that still talked about the way of Jesus and what Jesus did. People were talking about Jesus, and if it wasn't real, this conversation wouldn't have been able to carry on the way it did. Because remember, Jesus was like this viral thing. It's like a viral video. Like as he began to take root in places, he began to spread and sneeze out to other places. It was a huge movement that was happening. Finally, the followers of the way, as Acts tells us, were so outside of cultural norms that they impacted the very culture they were a part of. For instance, the commonplace of the cross as a discussion point, which if you look at Paul, you can see that even after Jesus, the discussion of the cross happened quite a bit, was one that for centuries you didn't openly talk about. Because it was so violent and so horrible that like it would be like cussing in front of your grandma. And I'm not talking like one of those nice cuss words either. Like this was vile, brutal stuff that you didn't talk about in social service circles at this time. And not only did they like talk about it, but pretty soon the cross became a central symbol of their movement, and really in relatively short order. And these are just the starting point. I don't have time to get into much more, but I wanted to throw out a couple to you, and the proofs of his life really continue. And these are just kind of a rundown version of a couple of them. And if you ever get interested and want to see some more evidence of this, there's a movie on Netflix called The Case for Christ, and it's actually a halfway decent Christian movie. And it tells the story of a journalist who's trying to debunk or disprove Christ. And he runs into some compelling evidence beyond even these supporting the claims of Christ. But the reality is, what does this all mean? So what? Jesus was a person in history. That doesn't prove that he was, it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove that he was God. It doesn't prove that he was the Messiah. Well, here's the deal. If Jesus is real, and I think we've somewhat established that there's probably good reason to believe that he was, and if the accounts of him are true, that must mean something. And that means that if he claimed to be the Messiah, only one of three things are true. First of all, he's a lunatic. If I were going around claiming that I was Messiah, you guys would probably kick me out and not want anything to do with me. You would simply say that I was a crazy man. But this doesn't line up with the message and the power that Jesus brought. It doesn't seem to be the case. There were people all around him, hundreds of people following him, and many of those were around him a lot. They would have seen his crazy. I mean, how many of you guys have a best friend that you hang out with all the time and you know they're crazy? Like, you know every crazy element about them. You know what their crazy moment is, their crazy point is. Like, these people would have seen this in Jesus. The second option is that he's simply a liar. He's lying about all this. But again, lying in front of that many people is just dangerous. It's a dangerous game to play. Not to mention the life and the proof that we have of his resurrection completely kind of almost breaks that out as an even possibility. And finally, the last option is that he simply is the Lord. And he is who he claims to be. And if that's true, it requires something of us to really follow him. It requires us to give our lives to him. And it requires that we accept him and walk in relationship with him, and that means something in our lives. I love what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 12 through 19. He says, "But tell me this, since we preach that Christ rose from the dead, why are some of you saying there will be no resurrection of the dead? For if there's no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, then all of our preaching is useless, and your faith is useless. And we apostles would all be lying about God, for we have said that God raised Christ from the grave. But that can't be true if there's no resurrection of the dead. And if there's no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is useless, and you are still guilty of your sins. In that case, all who have died believing in Christ are lost. And if our hope in Christ is only for this life, we are more pitied than anyone in the world." Paul, in kind of the same generation as Jesus, is saying that if this really is not true, then we're wasting our time. If Jesus is a liar or a lunatic, in other words, then we're all just making a big mistake. We're to be more pitied than anyone else in the world because we've bought into the sham. Paul is basically telling them, listen, if this is about us making something up to fit a narrative, then we're wasting our time, and because we would still all be bound to our sin and lost without hope. But he says, since Christ is the Messiah, and since he is who he says he is, and he did raise from the dead, then we are alive again in hope, and there's a purpose and a plan for what we do, and all of it centers around Christ. So tonight, if you hear nothing else, hear this: Christ is more than a fairy tale, and since that is true, then his message means something. So let me just ask you this, and I don't need you to raise your hands or have any outwardly thing. I just want you to think about this question. How many of you have ever really struggled with the idea of Jesus? Or maybe you've really thought about it much, but the truth is that now we're faced with the fact that Jesus is real, and therefore what he has taught us means something. We are faced with the question, are we really following him? If you've never made that commitment to follow Jesus, I'd like to personally invite you to come into relationship with him, because he wants to be Lord in your life, and he wants to be in the middle of your story. So I just encourage you to talk to a leader, talk to me, and get to know Jesus and put him in the center of your narrative. Thanks for being with us, guys. We'll see you soon.